The topic is the African American Church and Historical Black Colleges. We're talking to Dr. James Baxter. Dr. Baxter, when we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd come back and give you an opportunity to further elaborate upon the relationship between these, the churches at that time. I think whether we call them the African American Church or the Black Church or the Colored Church, and et cetera. But all of these churches that were concerned about the moral and religious development of the African American race, and their efforts to recognize that education was a crucial role in how they attempted to meet that demand.
All right. Well, Dr. Haney, when we look at slave religion, it was against the order of the day for a slave to know how to read or write. So therefore, it placed the preacher in a vulnerable position. When I think in terms of that slave religion, when I think of the ignorance that ran rampant on slave plantations among the slave population simply because they could not read, it brings to mind their means of communication through those songs, Over My Head, Go Down Moses. But when we think in terms of education, the black church saw a great need for lifting the veil of ignorance. After emancipation or after slavery, going into the post-Civil War period, churches began to establish colleges for the sole purpose of educating the given population, the masses of black male and female. But the churches very specifically addressed the whole person. The churches were concerned not only about academics, the church was concerned in moral development. The church was concerned addressing and fulfilling the need of the whole person. And certainly, as Du Bois said very vividly, as he philosophized and within the many books that he wrote during his lifetime, I remember he said among the black race, there is a talented 10. That talented 10 was nurtured and trained by way of our black institutions. Then, of course, as we move further into the 20th century, the early 20th century, from that point forward, then certainly land grant colleges, agricultural institutions, mechanic institutions, such as Texas Southern, Tennessee State University, Alabama State. All the southern states began to allocate monies, to give land in the various southern states for the sole purpose of giving training to African-American students, not so much for formal education, but for agricultural and mechanic education. When we think in terms of Tennessee State University, at its inception, it was to offer a mechanical or an agricultural type of education for the Negro all across Tennessee. And then eventually, Tennessee State A&I attracted the Negro from all across America. And then in due season, we become Tennessee State University, and look at us today. So yes, the state has, the church has played a vital role in the education of the African American people all across America.
You know, one of the things that, and I think you mentioned Mr. Du Bois, and I'm often reminded of that great discussion between Mr. Du Bois and Mr. Booker T. Washington in terms of the status and the place for the African in American education. Why don't you speak to that?
Well, see, Dr. Haney, we have to understand that after emancipation, and certainly when slavery would become abolished in America, Booker T. Washington, he advocated vocational training. He established what becomes known as the Tuskegee machine. And his philosophy was that the freedmen or the emancipated slaves throughout the South should not aspire for first-class citizenship, should not aspire for a formal education, but come to Tuskegee, learn the vocational areas, and then pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Then in time, you will be accepted by the society at large, and in due time, at some point, we can then look at formal education. Du Bois, just the opposite. Du Bois believed that if the race were going to survive and move forward, that within the rank and file of the African American race, there were what he called the talented 10. These would be the individuals that would emerge as the leaders of the Negro race. They would lead the race forward. They would become the doctors and the lawyers and the engineers and the politicians. They would be the ones that would become the mayors and the senators and the congressmen and the representatives. So he totally disagreed with Du Bois. As African Americans, or as the Negro, or as the freedman, aggressively turn to these church-related colleges and the formal landmark institutions for education, then you have to deal with being terrorized. Terrorized by certain groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, or the White Citizen Council, and other terrorist groups throughout the South who wanted the Negro to stay in his or her place. So then our people during this particular period, the post-antebellum period, was terrorized. Some even lost life, lynched, mutilated, castrated, all because acquiring an education made them a threat to the status quo throughout the South. And you get into this notion, a smart Negro. You get into this notion, arrogant, too big for your britches, becomes a threat to the powers that be. So something has to be done with that particular Negro.
And of course, Brother Baxter, let's think in terms of the end of this segment to prepare when we come back to deal with some of these organizations and how these organizations were able to affect, in a real sense, to keep the African, as far as his education was concerned, sort of confined, and how by 1954, the so-called Brown versus Board of Education decision helped to, in a real sense, open up opportunities that perhaps had not been available before. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Pastor Marcel